ways. So Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1 says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto Abraham, Behold, here am I." And he said, and God said unto him, Abraham. And Abraham said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass, and excuse me, maybe I need to put my glasses back on. Sorry about that. And saddled his ass, and took his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for a burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, or the servants that he brought with him, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again unto you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they both of them went together. I want to talk to you a little bit on the question or the thought of, can God be trusted? Can God be trusted? Can you trust God? Two questions. You can be seated. Different ways of viewing it. Can you trust God? Can you trust God? You know, in relationships, we have different people in our life that we trust. Some we trust on one level, but on different levels we don't trust. Some we have in our life, we give them just a little bit of our trust because maybe their past would lead you to believe that they're not necessarily trustworthy. So you don't really trust them with a lot. You don't trust them with things that you feel are important. So in our relationships, we establish pretty quickly as we get to know different people how much we trust them, how much we would be willing to trust them with, say, our children, or a job or an assignment that we might give them. And oftentimes, if they burn us a couple of times, we'll, in our back of our mind, we'll kind of label that person perhaps and look at them and say, well, I can't trust this person. I can't trust this person with what I gave them because they didn't come through for me, or they weren't there when I needed them, or they weren't able to answer the call when I called upon them, so I can't trust. The unfortunate thing is that in the same way sometimes that we categorize our earthly relationships as trustworthy or untrustworthy, whether we believe it or not, the more that we get to know God and the more that we experience Him, there are different levels of our life that we gain trust in God. The question isn't really, is God trustworthy? We know God is trustworthy. I mean, how can we really gauge the trustworthiness of God? Our first problem is looking at God, and I think trying to equate God and our relationship with Him in the same way that we have our relationships with people. But Numbers 23:19 said, God is not a man that He should lie. That's the first problem that we have sometimes when God comes into our life. We use our standard, the same standard that we use to judge men or to judge the trustworthiness of men. We try to put it on God. But right here, the Bible says that God is not a man. We know that God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. God is trustworthy. He goes on to say, nor a son of mankind that He should change His mind. Has He said, and will He not do it? So in other words, if He said it, He will do it. I mean, we're talking about the God that hung the stars, the God that formed the earth. He spoke into darkness when there was nothing, when the earth was without form and void, and He spoke and there was light, and He saw it and there was good. At the very speak the very word of God, things change. If God says it, it's going to happen. There's no doubt about it. You can't label God as untrustworthy. But what we do, I think, is we say, when you look at the question this way, can you trust God? In other words, can you allow yourself to trust God? Because it's not a question of God's character. It's not a question of God's ability to fulfill your need, or a question of God's ability to heal you, or God's ability to provide. I mean, we're talking about the God, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the one that hung the stars, the one that that put the moon up, the one that set the seasons with one word. He spoke the seasons into existence, and God, the power of God, the Word of God, He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is God. He is God all by Himself. He's God whether or not you trust Him. He's God whether or not you believe Him. He doesn't need your approval. He doesn't need my approval, because He is God. And if He said it, it's going to happen. So the trustworthiness of God is not what is on trial here. God's ability to come through is not necessarily what is on trial, but what's on trial here is your ability to put your trust in God. Do you trust God with your problems? Do you trust God with the issues of your heart? Do you trust Him with the things that are going on in your life? Malachi 3:6 said, "For I am the Lord, I change not. I am the Lord, I change not." I think one of the biggest things that happens to us, that I see it, is, we can pray for someone and say, Hugo has an issue, and he's got an issue, he needs a healing over something, and I can pray for him, and I can believe that God can heal him. But then when the tables are turned and it comes up to me and I'm sick and I need a healing, that's when the questions really start to happen. See, it's easy to really put faith on someone else's situation, but when the situation is looking good in the face, then the question really becomes, can you trust God? Can you trust Him? You could trust Him for someone else, you could trust Him for a different situation, but can you trust Him now when things are happening to you? It's easy to trust God on some things it's not easy to trust Him with. And really what you find out is that you'll trust Him in the small things a little bit more. The things that maybe don't matter so much to you. Every day I trust that I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to go up to my car and it's going to start up. I trust Him because rationale says that's what's going to happen. It's easy to have faith for that, but it's much harder to have faith when you've been out of a job for 6 or 8 weeks or 3 or 4 months and the bills continue to pile up. It's hard to trust God when the collectors keep calling and things keep going on in your life. Can you trust God in that moment when things are really hard, when things are really tough? Because again, it's easy to trust God on the mountaintop, in a place of victory, and I think we covered this a little bit last week. You can celebrate the victories of God when you're in the midst of them, but can you still proclaim His victories when you're in the middle of a struggle? Can you still, when you're sick, when you're hurting, when you got pain in your back, can you still proclaim healing? Can you still believe that God is the healer, even though you're not healed? Can you believe that God is the provider, even though your bank account is a little low? And so you have to really be able to trust God from the beginning to the end. It's easy when God says to go. It's easy to go when you already wanted to go. It's easy to give when God says give and you got plenty of money in your bank account. It's easy to believe when everything's going well. But the question is, are you willing to go when God said go, when you really wanted to stay? Are you willing to give when God said give, and it just wasn't in the budget? That's what you've got to ask yourself. Where is your trust line with God? Because what's the difference? God said do it. Either you believe that He's going to provide for you, or you don't. We try to make faith, either you believe or you don't. It's black or white. Either you believe that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that you can ask or think. You believe that He's the healer. You believe that He's the provider. You believe that He's the one that makes a way when it seems like there's no other way, or you don't. You know, we as Christians can be highly critical of people who look upon other Christians and they pick and choose, they pick and choose what they want to believe, or they pick and choose parts of the Bible, whether or not that's applicable or whether or not it's not applicable. Faith works the same way. But we're not critical of people in that way. We don't really want our faith examined. We don't really want our trust examined. We would rather put God on trial and say, God, you didn't provide, even though I believed that you would. So in the scripture in Genesis we find Abraham. And Abraham, we know that Abraham is walking a journey, and he's walking with God. God came to Abraham in a dream or a vision, and he told him, Abraham, pack your things up, get up and go, I'm sending you somewhere. Abraham did not question God. He didn't say, God, I'd like to stay here a little bit longer. He got up, he packed his stuff, and he went. It's that kind of faith that continues to get Abraham. Now, of course, we know, if we look at Abraham's life, that things got a little bit rocky. He tried to take things into his own hands and ended up with Ishmael. Be careful that you don't try too much to control things on your own so that you end up with Ishmael when you could have had Isaac. Now, thank God, God's plan didn't change, and in spite of Ishmael, Isaac was still born. And so here we find one day that God has decided, and the translation here says to tempt him, that God decides that He's going to tempt Abraham. Now we know from James 1 and 13 that says, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot tempteth with evil, neither tempteth He any man. So it's very interesting that the translation here in Genesis says tempted, when now in the New Testament James says that God, that's crazy for you to think that God would tempt you. God doesn't have to tempt you. God doesn't tempt us. He tests us. And if you really broke down the word there, you'd see that maybe a more proper type of translation there would be that God decided that He was going to test Abraham. He was going to test Abraham's ability to trust Him. He was going to test Abraham's ability to have faith in Him. God is not tempting you. God is not setting you up to fail. I know that you might look at your situation and you might look sometimes at your circumstance and feel like failure is the only option, but I want to tell you that if God is in it, He's not setting you up to fail. He's not tempting you to bring the worst out of you, but He's testing you to bring the best out of you, to take those tests and say, God, I'm going to go through it, I'm going to make it, and I'm going to trust you no matter what. Abraham made his mind up that he was going to trust God. And just think about, and I don't know about you, this is just me, and if I could just speak plainly, how absurd it is for God to now ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, the promised son, the one that God said it's going to be through Isaac, through the seed. And now God is asking, after all that Abraham went through, and after all that God had overlooked with Sarah and Hagar and all after all that, now, God, you're asking me to give my son. Basically what you're saying is, the blessing that you promised me, now you want it back. Did you forget what we've been through to get to this point? Now you want it back. Are you willing to give the gifts of God that He's blessed you with back? Back to Him? Are you willing to really take the talent, the gifting, the anointing that God has put on your life and give it back to Him? some of us have like a hoarder mentality. We get something and we just want to hold on to it. We don't want to let it go. We don't want to put it. And the reason that we don't want to let it go, or we don't want to give it back, it comes back down to what? It comes back down to trust. Do you trust God enough to give it back? There's been many times in my life where I was afraid to step out by faith because I was afraid of what would happen. But God was saying, do you trust me enough? I put it in your heart to go do this, or I put it in your heart to pray this prayer for someone, or I put it in your heart to sow a seed into this ministry, or whatever it may be, to step out by faith, whatever it may be, I put it in your heart to do it. Do you trust me enough to do it? Do you trust me enough to stick with it, even though it's hard and even though it's been a struggle? Do you trust God enough? It's a trust issue. So God instructs Abraham to take his son, whom he loves, and this is an amazing account. And when they said that the Old Testament is types and shadows of the New Testament, you can look and you can see the story of Christ almost playing out in this. And there's really two times in the Bible where it's a lot of times God is telling. God is speaking to us, but there's only really like two times in the Bible where it seems like God opens up, right? And lets us see on the inside of how He feels. Because one day He was going to give His only begotten Son. And so this is one of the stories. The other one would be in Hosea. And so God really kind of shows you from His point of view. He's showing Abraham from his point of view what it's like to give your only begotten, or your only son. He refers to Isaac as his only son. And so he requests it, and they go through, and Abraham again. It's amazing, Abraham's faith. It's amazing, Abraham just gets up, doesn't really question God. And this is where we struggle sometimes. When God puts something on our heart, or He puts a direction for us to go, we want to kind of negotiate with God, right? Well, God, I'll do it if you do this, if this works together, if you provide all the money, if you provide all the finances, if you open up all the doors. Well, if it was necessarily easy, we'd all take off. But unfortunately, the journey, God didn't say it would be easy. God didn't say that it would just be straight all the way. But some battles are uphill. Some victories have to be fought uphill. So Abraham just gets up and he goes, and he doesn't tell Sarah, because there's no telling how that would have went. There's sometimes you can't tell people the things that God has put on your heart because they won't understand it. I wonder how things would have played out had he had to have that conversation with Sarah. I'm sure she would have felt probably how I would think I would have felt. And I would have said, there's no way. It'd be easier for us to just take our son and leave and forget God. Because God, I'm willing to sacrifice some things, but I'm not willing to sacrifice my son. I'm not willing to sacrifice Isaac. You want me to send Ishmael away? Fine, no problem. Ishmael, go. But Isaac, no, I'm not willing to give up Isaac. What parts of your life are you not willing to give up? What things in your life, in your heart, from your past, that maybe you're not willing to give up? You say, God, go anywhere but there. Deal with me on anything, but not that. Don't touch that. Don't touch that point in my past. Don't touch that time that I went out and I had a few too many drinks and I said some things that I didn't mean to say. Don't touch that point. I buried that. But God, you can deal with me anytime you want on that time I stumped my toe and a few words slipped out that shouldn't have slipped out. That's no problem. But don't touch the deep things. Don't touch the things that I've spent a lot of time burying. And, it's amazing how sometimes people, you just pretend like things didn't happen. And you just continue to go on. And all along, God's kind of knocking on your door saying, you're trusting me for all these things. You're trusting me for deliverance over all these things. But this one thing that I've been trying to uncover and I've been trying to pull out, you won't let go of it. So Abraham grabs everything that he needs to go out and make the sacrifice. And they begin to travel. He gets the wood, he gets the stuff to make the fire, he gets the donkeys, he gets 2 servants to help him along the way. And finally, after a couple of days, 3 days, he sees the space. Now remember, God didn't tell him where it was going to happen. Ask yourself this, sometimes are you willing to go in a place where you don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be? Many people aren't willing to step out into that kind of a faith because they, again, you just don't trust God enough. You don't trust God enough when God asks you to do something. God has an amazing way of leaving out details. I don't know about you, but sometimes God leaves out details. Yeah, on purpose. Because if you knew the details, you'd probably mess it up. So he says, I'm going to leave these details out, and I'm going to lead you. And you just go, and when you get there, I'll let you know. And so that's basically what he did with Abraham. So he gets everything ready, and he's got the servants with him. And finally he sees the space, and he's going to go out, and he turns to the 2 servants, and he says, all right guys, you guys stay here, and me and Isaac, we're going to go worship. And he says something really interesting. He says, we'll come back. We'll come back. Both of us are going to come back. He was already believing God. He already trusted God. It's interesting though, sometimes he had those 2 servants and he brought them with him, and those servants helped him get to that point. Because there are some people in your life that God puts in your life to help you to get to one point, but eventually in one season they'll help you get to where you want to go, but sometimes you'll have to leave them behind. Because they're not called to go to the place that you're called to go to. So Abraham looked at the 2 men, the 2 boys, and he said, you guys stay here. Don't hold on to relationships that God is trying to separate you. I know they helped you on this journey. I know they got you as far as they've gotten you, but God's saying they helped you in this season, but now some places you've got to go alone. You have to go alone, because I can imagine that if those 2 servants would have gotten to the place of sacrifice with Abraham and realized what Abraham was about to do, they probably would have looked at him and said, the old man is going crazy. See, they would have been a help to him up to that point, but they would have been a potential hindrance to him when it came down to do what God called him to do. So God takes people in and out of your life. But do you trust him to remove some people and replace those people with another relationship? And I'm not saying, because I'm not the kind of person that believes that you just ditch people out of your life completely. I mean, well, you would probably all agree there are some people probably that you can just, and you'd be okay, you'd be fine. No problem, you would never sweat a tear. But there are some people that really bond with you, really have a relationship with you. But they're only in your life for a season. They're only in your life for a time. And then that time comes where God kind of begins to separate you. If you're not careful, you can try too hard to hold on to those relationships. And what will happen is it'll keep you from reaching the very point that God's trying to get you to. So, we got to pray and be sensitive to the Spirit and be sensitive to the direction that God's going. And be careful that we don't try to carry things with us or carry people with us that God didn't intend for us to take. Because eventually, they're going to probably become more of a burden. If they weren't going to be a burden, God would have allowed them to stay. So when you have that friend in your life and all of a sudden they stop calling you and you don't understand why, just try to think and say, God, what are you trying to do here? What's going on here, Lord? What's happening here? Do you trust God with your relationships? Do you trust God with your relationships? Do you trust God with your friendships? So some people have to be left behind, and not everyone's going to make it to the end with you. But we know that it's not necessarily how you start as much as it is how you finish. And I think Abraham was really setting himself up to finish pretty well. But then it kind of gets interesting, because this is another thing that we have to learn through experience and through the journey is how do I walk in faith when it hurts? How do I, because let me tell you something, walking by faith and not by sight is going to require you to walk through some situations that are going to hurt, that are going to be heavy, that are going to be burdensome. Abraham, though he's believing God and trusting God, still now with his son, comes to the place where he's going to sacrifice Isaac. And he begins to prepare the sacrifice. And at this point, it's evident that Isaac obviously knows that they're going together to offer up a burnt offering unto God. It could have been something that they had done time and time, and as a matter of fact, I'm sure they probably did. Abraham probably took Isaac with him on several occasions to go and give an offering unto the Lord. And so Isaac was familiar with the process, and as Abraham begins to put everything together, and Isaac, I'm sure, begins to put everything together in his own mind, and then the light bulb goes off. Dad, I see the wood, I see the fire, wood, fire, but there's no lamb. Can you imagine now what kind of an impact that would have had on Abraham? Because now he's got to confront it with Isaac. It's one thing to just kind of do it and bury yourself in the process of moving forward, but then it's another thing to kind of stop and begin to analyze what's really beginning to take place in your life. Because when you begin to analyze what's going on in your life and really begin to deal with where God's taking you, and you start trying to see how things line up, or maybe in this case how they're not really lining up, but yet you know that God has to do it, and now somehow Abraham has to explain to Isaac, I know that I'm your dad, and you know that I love you, and you're my gift, you're my promise, you're my seed, but there's no lamb for the sacrifice. But instead of doing that, instead of dwelling on the negative, Abraham said, don't worry about it, Isaac. God will provide a sacrifice. God will provide. How many times have you gotten so close to where God wanted you to be, and you took a moment to have a little bit of retrospect on the things that are going on, and you started looking at how things weren't lining up, and you started seeing all the negative, and you said to yourself, this just isn't working out the way that I thought it was going to work out. How many times have you talked yourself out of achieving what God had for you because things were going the way that you thought they should necessarily go? Abraham, in that very moment, and I don't know, that might have been me, because if I would have had to take Caleb up to that mountain, and all of a sudden it's yes, God, let's go, let's do it. God, I believe you, I trust you, and I know that you're gonna provide. But now it's time to get Isaac on the altar, and there's no lamb. There's no sacrifice. And now, not only that, Isaac realizes it. Can you trust God in that moment when all the emotion of what you're going through begins to just pour in? Or will your emotions override your faith and cause you to doubt and really fail to believe and fail to trust in God? Can you figuratively speaking, stand over Isaac with the knife and be ready to do what God asks you to do. You know, the Bible says that Isaac was bound. Now, you don't have to bound somebody that's willingly sacrificing themselves, giving themselves over. So, you know, I'm just kind of putting maybe two and two together, but that would lead me to believe that at some point Isaac realized he was the sacrifice. And even though he was young and his dad was his dad, maybe he didn't feel like being the one laying on the altar that day. So Abraham had to physically bind Isaac and lay. Can you imagine the emotion of that? Tying up your son and laying him on an altar? You know, thank God we've never had to do that. But there's been plenty of other things in our life that we've had to tie up to get it under control just long enough to lay it on the altar. Because some things in your life, they're not going to go easy. There are some issues in your heart that they're not going to just jump out and say, oh, I'm through with you, Neil. No, they're not going to do that. I'm through with you, John. You got to bind them and lay them on the altar and say, God, here they are. I turn it over to you. But you can't do that if you don't trust. If you don't trust God. Abraham trusted God enough to go through the emotion, the journey, the struggle. Of all of those things, he said, I'll deal with it, God, because I'll believe that you'll provide. Do you trust God that much? You know, another thing that's very interesting that you really need to stop and think about is in the beginning of this encounter, God speaks to Abraham, right? He says, go and take thy only son and make him as an offering, a burnt offering. That was the word. God said it. Now, Abraham has gotten to the point where Isaac is on the altar, bound, ready to go. He's got the knife in his hand, and it's up, and he's ready to plunge it into his son. He's ready to kill the promise and offer him to God. And in the midst of all of this, and I can imagine Isaac down there just, there's no telling how Isaac is reacting here, it doesn't say, but you can imagine how the emotion that's going through Abraham, he lifts it up, and he's probably got his eyes closed, and he's thinking in his mind and his heart, okay, God, this is it. I trust you. And then all of a sudden, the voice of God comes down and speaks to him and says, whoa, Abraham, don't harm him. Don't harm him. Now, this is a very important part, because this is where in your walk with God, sometimes you got to make sure that your ear is open to hear what God is saying, and not get so stuck up sometimes on what God said. Because God can say one thing in one season of your life, and then in another season you can get so caught up in what God said that you'll miss out on what God is saying to you currently. Abraham could have said, God, I know you said sacrifice him, and even in the account of Hebrews that we're going to read in a little bit, it says that Abraham knew that God was able and that he could raise Isaac up if he wanted to, but still Abraham lifted up the knife, and if he would have just been so stuck on the fact that God said to offer him as a burnt sacrifice, he could have ignored the voice of God at that point and plunged the knife into Isaac and offered him a burnt sacrifice. But no, Abraham trusted God enough so that when God spoke up, he stopped everything and said, all right, God, I hear your voice. I hear your voice, so I got to stop and I got to hear what you're saying now and not be so caught up on what you said then. Amen?
Amen.
Miracles still happen. God still heals. I'm talking about miraculous healing. God still intervenes. You know, some would argue that those types of things have left the church. The only reason that they've left the church is because of our failure to trust. Our failure to believe that God can really do it. Abraham, in his heart of hearts, believed and trusted. So much to the point that he was ready to drop the knife. And then all of a sudden God spoke. I provided a ram in the bush. And then he looked over, and out of nowhere, out of absolute nowhere, now there's a ram with his horns stuck, struggling in a bush. And now we're going to remove Isaac, and we're going to replace him with the ram. And the ram is going to be what we have to give up, or we're going to give as the burnt offering. God will never ask something of you without a plan to replace it. God will never ask you to give one thing up without a plan to replace it for something better. But you'll never get to that point if you don't trust Him. You'll never get to that point if you don't trust Him. It takes an extremely terrible situation sometimes in order for a miracle to happen. Because if you could do it on your own, there'd be no need for a miracle. I don't need a miracle for my yard to be mowed. I need to go out of my garage, fire up my lawnmower, and mow my yard. So sometimes it takes a miracle to get Caleb to do it. But you don't need a miracle for that kind of thing. Do you trust God enough to the point that He could lead you to a situation where it's so rough and so hard and such a heavy weight on your shoulders to put you in a place so that your life could be a miracle, that your life could be a testimony to someone else? Do you trust God enough to say, I surrender my life to you to the point that God, if I got to be laid flat on my back, I know that you'll raise me up? Because supernatural things don't happen in the natural. As we stand, can you trust God? The lesson from the mountain today: always trust God. Always trust the direction. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shalt thou seed be called. And this is why he could do it. He said, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Abraham knew that no matter what he went through in that moment with Isaac, when it came down to it, that one way or the other, God was able. He trusted God enough to say that no matter what happens, I'm still going to trust Him. I'm still going to believe in Him. I'm still going to put my faith in Him. I'm still going to lean on Him. I'm not going to lean on myself. I'm not going to lean on my situations. I'm not going to lean on the circumstances. I'm not going to lean on what people say. I'm not going to lean on relationships. I'm not going to lean on my bank account. I'm not going to lean on my job. I'm not going to lean on anything else. But I'm putting my trust and my faith in God, because I know that even though it may come right down to the wire, and I know that there's some of you in here that it has come right down to the wire, but I want to tell you that even though it seems like you've gotten right down to the wire, there is still a ram in the bush for you if you'll trust Him. God is going to provide for you. All you've got to do is trust and believe in Him and say and stand for it and be willing to do what God has called you to do. He will not ask you to do something that you cannot do, or that He will not empower you to go through. Every journey, every mountain that you climb in your life, God does not set you in that direction without already knowing that you can make through it. My question is, do you trust God enough to climb that mountain? Do you trust God enough to take Isaac and the things that it'll take to make the sacrifice and climb that mountain and get to that place so God can provide, so God can make a way? Do you trust Him? Is God trustable? Yes, of course He is. But can you trust Him? Can you allow yourself, can you put your guard down long enough from around some things in your life to really trust Him and say, God, here it is. No matter what your Isaac is, here it is. I'm giving it to you. I'm giving it to you. Hallelujah. What in your life today is God saying, lay on the altar? Lay on the altar. Give it over to me. What in your life today? Maybe it's something from your past. Maybe it's something that you went through. Maybe it's something that you're currently going through. Doubt, pain, sickness, depression, oppression, self-esteem issues, confusion, fear, all these things. Whatever it is, trust God enough. Give it to Him. Let Him take care of it. He'll make a way. Let's pray. Hallelujah.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I